Well, hello, everyone. Let's make a start as others start to join us. Welcome to today's webinar, which is part of the EVS InsideOut webinar series. Our session today, balanced computing, choosing the right combinations of hardware and software and employing them in a balanced way between on-prem and edge and public and private cloud, I should say. I just wanted to set the scene before we get started. The number of businesses that are selecting their infrastructures to be a mix of hardware and software deployed on-prem, edge, or via cloud is certainly increasing. Cloud computing usage has been increasing, although the pandemic had a significant impact on the trend. The digital transformation started long before COVID restrictions and remote productions were imposed. Businesses are looking to create a balanced infrastructure that can allow them to run their back-end operations cost-effectively, securely and efficiently, while reaching the end user easily, focus on optimizing their experience. So how can companies choosing between on-prem, edge, cloud, or the mixture of these models? And what is the ideal approach when talking about large event productions for both rights owners and rights holders? Well, in today's session, I have a great panel that are going to share some of their thoughts around this. So to make some introductions, we have Oliver Parker, who's Chief Operations Officer at Blackbird. Oliver, welcome.
Hi there. Hi, Lisa.
We have Bevan Gibson, who's Chief Operating Officer at EMG. Hi, Bevan.
Hi, good afternoon, Lisa.
And finally, we have Alex Redfern, who's Chief Technology Officer at EVS. Hi, Alex.
Hi, Lisa.
And I'm Lisa Collins, and I've got the pleasure of moderating the session today. Now, we will make time for questions at the end. So if you have questions, please post them in the chat function, and we will take those time permitting at the very end. So let's make a start. So Bevan, if I can come to you first, could you talk us through EMG's infrastructure, the offering and how EMG normally operates and the factors you take into account when it comes to big events and live content?
So I guess for us, there's differences between big one-off events and big recurring events. So for us, we look at recurring events probably to try and be as operationally efficient as possible, and that's everything from commercial equipment operations and even sustainability. And I know I'm sure we'll talk about that a bit later, but for us, if it's a recurring event, our infrastructure, we try and be as remote as possible. We try and obviously be very efficient with the utilization of our people and infrastructure, and that usually means centralized production or decentralized production as opposed to sort of all on-prem. When it comes to big one-off events like the World Cup that's obviously being prepared in Qatar at the moment, us and a number of other equipment suppliers and broadcast facility suppliers tend to do all those sort of things on-prem because it doesn't necessarily make sense to put in the connectivity or the ability to do those sort of events remotely. So I think, yeah, depending on the event and on the bigger events, if it's a one-off, probably tends to be more on-prem. If it's recurring, probably more highly likely to have remote elements in it.
Okay, and what changes are we seeing from an operational and technical perspective?
Operationally, I think, again, we're trying to drive that utilization of infrastructure. We want, instead of a piece of equipment being used once in a week or twice in a week, we're trying to use it 3-4 times, maybe 3-4 times in a day, which of course is massively efficient. Technically, again, this is changing. The biggest events will always be very high quality. You'll always have UHD, HDR, particularly in Europe, and on big worldwide events. But from a technology perspective, I think what we're seeing now is remote models also enabled not only the biggest events, but smaller events that perhaps wouldn't have been otherwise commercially viable to operate can now be done for a relatively cost-effective price. So I think it's opening up the market to perhaps lower tier live events than what would have been economically viable previously.
Interesting, thanks. Alex, can I come to you next? When you're working with major live sports events, what's the challenges of dealing with connectivity and bandwidth?
I think to jump on Bevan's point, it sort of depends on the event. In many cases, if you're working on a sort of a live event where there's multiple venues feeding back to a central location, you have to take into account the bandwidth between those. And obviously some people will want to work uncompressed, but more often than not, you need to compress feeds to transport them. When you're talking about real-time video, you have to compress feeds to transport them. So you need to start looking at the type of compression that you use, the path that the compression takes. Is it a point-to-point link? Does it go via the cloud? Is it public cloud? Is it private link? And then because that enables you to make a technology choice. Do you go with something more heavily compressed, or something that's a higher bandwidth and a lower latency, or the opposite, where you tend to sort of increase latencies the more compression you add? So when you're talking about connectivity and bandwidth, one of the first things you have to talk about is compression and how you compress things, and then really it's about how you move the signal. So it's quite interesting because we see a lot of people moving signals moving real-time video flows, I should say, between sites. But there's then the opposite. Actually, if you have even less bandwidth, sometimes if you have less connectivity, I should say, and you want to retain bandwidth in the venue, you start to look at this idea of perhaps like remote control modeling, where you want to take control of the equipment remotely. And actually control, when it comes to connectivity and bandwidth in control, you can work with much lower bandwidths, you can perhaps work with higher latencies, and then you can retain perhaps even uncompressed video, say at the venue, and have the operators working remotely. So it's really about which model you pick. It sort of influences the technology choices that you make. And the goal is really to enable people to be able to make either choice successfully, and even combinations of the two, by the way, as well.
Okay, so once the data is in the IBC, how does EVS support content owners manage that data and distribute it?
Yeah, once you've brought things into a central location, like a broadcast center, then you're at the point of a more sort of, I would say, traditional workflow. You're going to ingest content. You're going to want to sort of perhaps store it, edit with it, archive it, and then distribute it. And the distribution part is what's changed recently, or not even recently, but sort of over the last few years. The distribution has evolved more from a distribution within the broadcast center, to stakeholders within the broadcast center, whether they're rights holders, whether they are just teams, going to the graphics team or the promotions team or the various in-house teams. And now we see, as that distribution model changes, people don't want to travel, or they expect to have files delivered to them in different formats in different locations. Then you're in that point of distribution. So that's where we've seen a shift towards the cloud for content distribution. That's where we've seen that it's better perhaps to store content in the cloud, because then it's easier to move between locations, or to download, to transcode, to move around. So that's where we start to get into the idea of balance. There's this balance of, I'm bringing something into a central location, either as real time or as files. I'm storing it, I'm processing it in some way, but actually the best place to process it and store it might not be in that physical building. It might be sort of on the edge or in the cloud. And that's really where the balanced compute message starts to come from. So we help them to sort of content owners to manage and distribute it with products like Media Hub, enable you to be able to search for content and initiate a workflow. There might be a transfer to another country. It might just be a simple download to my computer so I can open it in an edit system.
Okay, we'll come back to balanced computing approach in a minute, but if I can move over to Oliver. Oliver, where does Blackbird fit into the workflow, and what is the importance of cloud for you?
Well, we'll fit in, anywhere we can. But I think the truthful answer is wherever is most efficient, right? So interestingly, Bevan's talking about being on site for certain types of events and having, remote or different infrastructure set up for long-term ones. And Alex is talking about when different things happen at different pieces of the chain. For us, it's about what you're trying to get out of that process. So if speed is the most important thing, we might be in the, on the live feeds in the truck. If you're still working in a live environment, but actually you need third parties to start to be able to get to content and use content. And there might be integration with other platforms starting to happen, then we might be in the IBC. If we're talking long-term access to archive and more of a permanent installation, then maybe we'll be in the cloud infrastructure or something else. So that's the the part of Blackbird that's actually getting the content, the ingest, the publishing, and the heavy lifting piece of it can fit into any part of that chain, hopefully to complement the other things that are happening within that area. But obviously for us, cloud is completely important, because even though we're fitting into potentially on-premise or private public cloud parts of the workflow, the users are always in the cloud. So we use the browser environment as the easiest way to scale and access the tools for the user point of view, even though obviously we might be changing things up in the background around where the actual content sits and where the compute is happening and the storage is and things like that as well. So cloud is critical, but it's not everything in terms of how we achieve those workflows in the most efficient way.
Yeah, and you talked about private and public cloud there. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the choices there?
Yeah, so I think that's widening a bit. We've got people with on-prem infrastructure. We've got people running virtual stacks, which could be classed as a private cloud. We've got private bits of public cloud, and we've got public cloud and all sorts of things going on. Interestingly enough, if you're going to pick globally one industry that might benefit more from private cloud than public, it would probably be the media industry, because of the amount of data that's involved with video, because of concerns over quality and security and things like that as well. But at the same time, the nature, as Bevan was talking about, the nature of the coverage of certain live events within the sports world, also within the news world, elections and lots of other things like that. Actually, the flexibility of public cloud is really important as well. And I think that actually, public cloud has been available as the first really mature platform to start to do these kinds of workflows. But I'm pretty sure we'll end up certainly with most large businesses in some kind of hybrid setup where there's some on-prem or private cloud infrastructure set up for permanent workflows where they have a higher degree of control and certainty and so on. And then obviously lots of services available within the public cloud realm to allow for scaling up and flexibility and resilience and things like that as well.
Great, thank you. Alex, coming back to the balanced computing approach, can you give us a better understanding of what we mean by balanced computing, and how do you define the right balance when it comes to choosing and deploying the appropriate software and hardware?
Yeah, but balanced computing, so it's kind of what I touched on earlier. There's a need to deploy things on-prem, and there always will be when we're talking about uncompressed video flows and high bandwidth signals. But when we start to look at the need for compute power and scalability and security and all sorts of other things, there's a clear transition towards the cloud for some of those technologies. However, we see a real balance between the two. We see that we have to be able to balance between the two, because you cannot move. You can't produce a football match with 32 UHD cameras and expect to ingest all of those into the cloud without some compromise, be it compression or latency or security or something like that. So balanced computing for us is just about finding the right balance between where to deploy the services, a mixture of on-prem, perhaps of edge, and perhaps of cloud. Whether it's public or private doesn't really make a difference. Now, actually, there is no right balance or wrong balance. The balance depends on the need, on the scenario, on the event that's being produced. So there's instances where everything is in the cloud. We've seen all of these recent productions where the whole production is in the cloud, and equally there will still be the need for productions to be wholly on-prem because the connectivity doesn't exist in the football stadium for the third tier in the middle of nowhere. They're not going to have gigabits of connectivity. In those bigger models, in those big event models, or those bigger event models, even perhaps at tier 2, there's a balance between, and we'll start to see a mixture of on-prem deployment and perhaps then more of a shift to some of the CPU or the compute processing being done in the cloud, or the distribution done through the cloud, but perhaps not the ingest and the play out, because for security reasons you want to keep your play out close to you. Same with archive, like something like archive where you want to store a lot of data. There's two trains of thought. There's the thought of storing data is expensive. I don't want to pay for a big, massive SAN on-prem that I have to cool, I have to give power to, I have to give rack space to, when I can do it in the cloud where it's scalable. But then there's the converse train of thought, which is, well, the cloud could be expensive for that. It could, storage in the cloud could be expensive to perhaps egress it. It's just about taking every opportunity and finding what the right balance is between cloud, edge, and on-prem.
Yeah, absolutely, and keeping it flexible.
Absolutely, yeah.
Bevan, if I can come back to you, when talking about big events, obviously connectivity has a big role. What are some of the factors the right owners consider when choosing what part of the workflow should be hosted on-prem rather than on the cloud? And when does it make sense to use edge computing?
So I think I can probably answer that best by, excuse me, saying one of the facilities we provided in the summer for the European Athletics in Munich. We did host broadcast facilities. We did 10 or so control rooms in Munich. And as Alex said, you don't often want to do all of the 120 UHD or HD cameras going into a production environment. That doesn't make sense, nor would it be particularly cost effective to do in the cloud. So what we did there is that was all on site. All of the host activity, if you like, was on site, and there were a few rights holders. But I think had we have done that event 5 years ago, a lot more of the rights holders would have been on site. And I think events like that is where you see a lot of that content, and we worked with EVS on this event and pushed a lot of that content to the cloud. So if you're a rights holder, don't necessarily want to send a big presence or a lot of equipment to the big event, you can still pick and choose the content you want, and perhaps the events that your local country folk are into remotely, and you can do a lot of that heavy lifting in the cloud as opposed to being on-prem and going to site to do these sort of events. So I think they're the factors. If you're a federation, you still probably want to produce your event locally. But if you're a rights holder or a media rights holder for your local market, doing that sort of stuff remotely using cloud technologies makes absolute sense, and pulling infrastructure and using products like Blackbird to do stuff remotely, which means you don't need to have that massive, sometimes expensive presence on site for these big events.
Interesting, thank you. Oliver, tell us about your experience when it comes to how users choose to deploy specific parts of their infrastructure on-premise and in the cloud.
Sure, yeah. I think we actually probably, if we look at our customer base, it's probably a pretty even mix between workflows that are entirely cloud-based and workflows that have the media or the origination of streams and publishing and that side of the thing of things on premise. And there's a couple of factors Alex talked and Bevan have both talked about, some of the very good reasons from an architectural point of view and connectivity and infrastructure and so on that you might stick on premise for certain types of events. I think as well, outside of the live kind of sports events world, for us, just legacy infrastructure can be a major factor towards people sticking on premise. And the ability to add cloud aspects to a workflow without forcing a business to take a kind of all or nothing approach to cloud is pretty powerful, because that can, it's an easier step to take. It allows you to take advantage of some of the technology and the infrastructure and the processes that are already in place as well. So, balanced computing is, can be something you deploy greenfield, but it can also be an important part of helping people change, on a, in a slightly slower path through to those types of workflows. I think we've actually, if you go back a few years, a lot of companies did go like all in on cloud because, for the sake of it, to a certain extent, not to be too mean about it, but we're starting to see the fallout from that a little bit, I think, and we're starting to see people take a step back from entire cloud workflows and infrastructure as a service setups for various reasons. But balancing that and approaching each part of a workflow individually and using the best tool or the best infrastructure or the best setup for that job is always going to be, the most efficient way to handle it, I think.
Excellent. Let's talk a little bit about costs. We have been used to working in a CapEx-driven world in the past, and we're now gradually shifting towards a more of an OpEx pricing model. Alex, what do you think are some of the considerations businesses have to make when it comes to the right cost management strategies for their businesses?
I think it's a real tough one, because obviously broadcast has been and still is to a certain extent. The broadcast world is still a very CapEx driven environment, and as we see that transition towards more OpEx business models, and obviously cloud is sort of pretty much purely OpEx. I think totally, in fact. People have to factor that in, and it's twofold. I think manufacturers like EVS, we have to factor in a shift from CapEx revenue to OpEx revenue and the way we recognize that, and then how we pass that on to our customers as well. And then when we're working with service providers or systems integrators and people like EMG, they can be obviously OpEx driven. I'm sure Bevan will talk a bit about that as well. So there's a real sweet spot to find, I would say, in how the change happens in selling products and selling solutions that shift more to an OpEx model versus customers who perhaps still want to buy in CapEx or who still think in CapEx mindsets and life cycles, and there's still an amortization life cycle that we have to go through. It's a very, there's no one size fits all. There's no one thing that will work for every customer. And I think then obviously subsequently we have to be more flexible in business models and be able to cater for different customers wanting different things, basically.
Okay, and Bevan, your thoughts on this?
Personally, as Alex says, it's quite market specific. It depends what territory you're operating in. The answer will change. But for us, I think we are CapEx centric. We are a broadcast facilities companies. We rent cameras and lenses and we provide those services. But and often it makes sense for us. Our business is all about utilisation and getting those utilisation levels right. But we can't do the final game of a football season where perhaps 30 or 40 clubs are all playing a simultaneous game. We don't have the trucks or the cameras and the lenses for that. But what we can do is we can rent cameras and lenses and we can burst into the cloud for perhaps the lower 20% of those matches. We wouldn't have been able to cover them earlier. So it's still primarily CapEx for us, but OpEx is making great strides into it, but it will be a long time before I think OpEx overtakes CapEx in our world anyway.
Okay, thank you. And Oliver, do you agree with what's been said by Alex and Bevan?
I do, of course. But I would say, from our side as a albeit, like I said, we can deploy in different ways. We're essentially a cloud service provider, right? So what we do is all OpEx or subscription-based licensing. I think one thing that I've seen as we've been through that journey with customers over it must be nearly 10 years now, really, where the move to OpEx has been like a regular conversation with customer base, is that actually OpEx isn't necessarily scary. It's less about CapEx versus OpEx sometimes, and more just about predictability. So one thing that we're always very conscious of is that if you're moving to a SaaS or an OpEx-based model, that at least you can keep the cost predictable and under control, because I think that's probably the biggest fear that we see is the unknown and the hidden costs that come along with a lot of cloud a lot of the time.
I think we may have lost Lisa here.
Yeah.
So we may need to move on ourselves.
We've either lost her or she's having a nap.
Yeah. I think
the next question was going to be about security. Yeah. You're right. I guess for us, security, they're very different types of security. I mean, if it's an on-prem physical, we have to put physical steps in place. We have to lock containers and make sure that the physical security, and we keep networks set up. And I know in bid processes and tenders, depending on who the customer is, security is a very important factor, no matter if it's on-prem or in the cloud. But for us, the processes behind it are very different depending on where it is, but equally important. Oliver, what do you say?
Yeah, I think if we're looking at security and as part of the decision-making process, then it's an ever-present question and concern. No company's going to use a platform or a service if they don't feel confident in that. So we take steps to be up to date. We have a constant process through SOC 2 Type 2 accreditation and things like that to help businesses feel secure as part of that process. Because I think we think a lot about content security being in the business we're in. and there's various things that you can have in tools to help with that. But when you get into cloud service side of things, then you've also got user data, and you're into GDPR territory, and there's all sorts of other aspects to security as well. So it's totally important. It's a key part of any buying process when we go through any kind of significant contracting process. The one thing I would say, which I think I've spoken about before, is obviously businesses are conscious of this, and certainly when we deal with larger customers, there's a tendency to throw the media workflow piece of what we're doing into the same security processes that they use for their finance systems and global HR and things like that. Can be a little bit overkill, and it can be quite a lot to deal with sometimes, but at the end of the day, you've got to do what you've got to do to make them feel comfortable and secure in that process. So yeah, no, but it's you can't get away from it for sure.
Excellent. I'm sorry I dropped off my Wi-Fi. Went, maybe it was something to do with the security. So I think we've moved on to security there.
We did. Yeah, we did. We took a slightly different approach to security. Well, no, not different. We took we actually a few years ago hired a security expert, thinking that security was obviously going to take off. What we did instead was look at sort of micro segmentation and zero trust approach to security. So actually decided to build a product to focus on security, called EVS Shield, and it was something that we decided to focus on that as a specific product, because we noticed that we play in a lot of environments with a lot of third parties, where there are a lot of third party integrations, but also where there are a lot of people turning up with USB keys, plugging them in, and in an on-prem environment, there's an inherent risk with security. Certainly in a broadcast environment. When you're working in a more traditional IT, security seemed a lot tighter than it does in a broadcast environment. So our idea was to work on this EVS Shield to come up with a sort of a zero trust approach, and at the same time put a security framework in place around sort of detecting risks, analyzing them, responding to them, and then sort of doing a lessons learned. So really going through a security process that we can offer as a service to our customers who implement our products. So it was quite interesting, because we went from having nothing to having a fully fledged security product and team in 2 years. Basically, we literally, before the start of COVID, we had nothing at all. Now we have this.
And Alex, you're winning some awards for that product as well, aren't you?
Yeah, it won an award at IBC actually. So it won one of the Best in Show awards, I think, at IBC.
Yeah, and I think it's pretty unique that nobody else is actually doing it.
Yeah. Like I say, it was an interesting way for EVS to go, and one of the things we learned was that obviously you need a lot of services around security. You need to be able to consult. You can't just sell a product. With security in general, you need to know your stuff. So you have to be able to consult and justify the decisions that you're taking and making, and work with the customer. It's almost always a partnership, I would say.
Excellent. And Bevan, did you cover the security issues? That bit I missed. Yeah, we're all good.
Yeah.
Let's move on then. We talked, and Bevan, you touched on it earlier about sustainability. I'm really keen to hear all three of your comments about, the environmental impact that balanced computing approach has. Bevan, let's start with you, because you certainly brought it up earlier.
Yeah, I guess, again, territory specific or market specific, but a lot of our customers, this is a very important thing for them now. Everything from Albert certification to, are we using biodiesel in our facilities? And I guess it's things like, what's the impact on manufacturing hardware versus leasing hardware, which is essentially what we're doing with cloud. So if we can get utilization levels up on our own infrastructure, it's still never going to quite be at the utilization levels that I'm sure public cloud providers achieve with their hardware. So there's considerations there, remote and cloud usage of products, and maybe people not commuting to venues or where live locations are happening. There's an impact on the environment there. Again, very market dependent, and in the UK, it's a highly sensitive topic, as I'm sure all of you know. But that's coming across all markets in Europe, and very important for us. And I think we're only sort of, if you pardon the pun, the tip of the iceberg here. There's a long way to go, and it's only going to become increasingly important over the next few years.
Yeah, absolutely. And Oliver, I downloaded Blackbird's report just the other day on sustainability, so I know it's a hot topic for you guys. Can you share any more around this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, it ties in to everything else we've been saying today. I think, you know, it is important. It's important for every business and everybody. And you know, there's a lot of pressure on broadcasters and other companies, not just to look at environmental sustainability themselves, but to actually represent in data, you know, through all of their supply chain, what the impact of their operations are. So it's really important. And for us, you know, the big focus really is the difference between cloud as a way of running, you know, running the same piece of machinery but on someone else's rack, as opposed to cloud, the technologies like, you know, the web browser itself, and utilizing that. And obviously our big focus is squeezing as much as we can out of native cloud tech like the browser environment, to improve those efficiencies. So less people moving around and things like that, of course, but less data traffic, less media movement, less virtual machines running somewhere, less bandwidth for every single user. All of these things add up. But I think the best thing about it is, you know, it's a win-win, because if you're looking at efficiencies in those ways on every part of the chain from a sustainability point of view, it's also probably going to speed things up and save you money at the same time. So, you know, it's in everyone's interest in every way to be conscious of the impact of those kinds of things.
Right. And Alex, final word. I know sustainability is a huge topic for EVS. So your thoughts around this?
Yeah, we released our ESG report earlier this year. It's the first one we've ever released, and I think there's two areas of responsibility. There's one as a company. So I think this building I'm in now, we use fresh air from the outside to cool our equipment rooms. When the equipment rooms generate heat, we use that heat to circulate back in. So there's lots of efficiencies and things that as a company is good to do. Solar panels outside, you know, all sorts of things. We even have a beehive that generates honey and, you know, pollinates the local flowers.
Very good.
On the product side, there's some interesting things on the product side, though. We took an approach when we talk about computing. Some of the measurements around power consumption and cooling, when it comes to cloud, can be quite woolly because you're in a big data center. That you don't really know what you're running on, and you can make assumptions about things. With hardware, you can be very, very strict and very measurable in what you do. So the Neuron, as an example, is a 1U processing, can do up to 64 channels of video processing, 250 watts. So it's less than 4 watts a channel. Now, traditionally, you're talking 10 to 15 watts per channel, and you could of sort of a power consumption when it comes to video processing when you take traditional processing. So you can start to look at like number of channels processed, density of equipment, energy used to power that, combined with cooling and so on, where you can actually get some really measurable figures and set yourself targets as well to say, well, the next iteration we'd like to get to this. How do we do that? The next iteration we'd like to make smaller or lighter. For example, if we make, you know, smaller servers that are lighter, that only work with IP, that really impacts how Evan designs his trucks, because he needs fiber cables instead of copper cables and uses less weight, which means less fuel. So it's really, again, balance, I suppose. But it's that balance between what we do as a business for our employees and the world around us, and then what we do in our products that impact not just us, but our customers, our partners, and the people around us.
Yeah, and I'm guessing for all of you, we'll see more on this topic as we move forward.
Absolutely, yeah.
Excellent. Well, we said we would make time for questions. We haven't had anything through on the chat as of yet. So if anybody does have a question, please post it there, and we'll give a few moments for people to post. I mean, to each of you, are you able to let us into, you know, what we might see in this balanced computing area next? Are there more things to come? Oliver?
Yeah, I think there's more efficiency is probably the driver for us. So you know, we've got some interesting projects under our belt with EVS, particularly in the last couple of years, where we've you know, looked at balancing on-prem and cloud workflows around infrastructure, but certainly what we can do is get even tighter on integration and shared resources and things like that on that side. So there's always room to kind of polish and improve these workflows and try and add some extra efficiencies into that between suppliers, as well as just, you know, within the choice of the infrastructure, I think.
Yeah, Alex, any thoughts there?
We have two, I think. At IBC, as Oliver said, we did some nice stuff with Blackbird, showed the integration on a couple of products between, so the Media Hub integration with Blackbird, that's all cloud-based using Blackbird's cloud-based editor, and Media Hub hosted in the cloud as well. And we also showed our Mediaception solution being able to trigger the Blackbird editor and open it to be able to edit on top of a mixture of, I think it was on-prem content that was then sort of transferred into Blackbird's cloud service to be edited. So that was a nice display of balanced computing between on-prem and the cloud. And the other one that we showed was we did a POC of something called Cloud Recorders that we showed the demo of, you know, the proof of concept of at IBC, which is basically taking record channels and putting them in the cloud linked to our on-prem XT servers. The use case is you often have lower value cameras in a production, like in-car onboards, you know, in a car, or pole cameras, goal cameras that you might use once. You still want to have access to them, but you don't want to take up something that might be a very expensive record port or might take up density. And, you know, onboard cameras, there might be 3 per car, and in a NASCAR race, there's 30 cars or something like that. So it's a lot of inputs. So that was the use case that we showed, where as an operator, you didn't really know whether it was on-prem or in the cloud. I just browsed my content, made a clip, and played it out like normal. It was a POC, so we're sort of looking for that feedback. We're trying to show it to a few people, gather the feedback, and see which way we take it as a product. But it was a really good example of balanced computing.
Excellent. And Bevan, you know, your thoughts on future needs?
Well, I think for us, it's gone from one-off events that we did using cloud or a mix of the two to now we're now seeing regular recurring events, where probably the last 3 or 4 months, I think of 2 markets where we're now doing week in, week out events that do use that hybrid model of it's our own on-prem hardware, but we have a burst of events and it starts to burst into the cloud. So that's happening for us. It's much more of a reality and much less of a proof of concept for us. It's something we're doing on a regular basis, and I think that's only going to continue to increase.
Excellent. We do have a question here. It's been said for many years that Moore's law has allowed programming to cover its inefficiencies. As silicon heads to its limits, do you see programming getting leaner and more efficient?
I can maybe take that one in one way, that I think it will have to. I think there's the efficiency of developers and how they develop and write code, and I think you know, using a framework instead of really diving into the code and being efficient in the use of your code is one thing. There's also the efficiency of the language that you use. To be absolutely sort of on an interesting point that may be related. We have an internal conference for all of our R&D developers, and we have sort of 300 people come together and we do presentations. And one of the most fascinating presentations this year was about Rust as a programming language. And Rust is actually one of the most efficient programming languages. So you start to get into this idea of using, could we shift and use a different programming language? Would that make us more efficient to deliver code? But would it also make the code more efficient in terms of sort of ESG, you know, sustainability? I don't know whether that covers the answer. That would be how I would phrase it. We as an R&D team look into those kind of things and do that kind of research. Sometimes it's a big shift to change your product. If it's been written in one language, to change it to the other, it's not always easy, or it takes time. But it is certainly something that we look at on a regular basis. How can we be more efficient in the way that we write code and the way that code uses the silicon underneath it?
Excellent. So he was about to ask about Rust, so thank you. That works really nicely. Has anybody got anything to add, Bevan?
Probably more Oliver than me. I mean, we do write code, but probably not on the scale that what you guys do.
Yeah, no.
And
I agree with Alex. You know, it will have to. There's a much more direct correlation now. You know, when certainly with the area we work in, to do with, you know, we're making the browser do a lot of work, right, basically. You know, in a JavaScript environment as well as beyond, then there's a much more direct correlation between the way you develop and the resource you use, which didn't really apply if you jump back in time a bit with, you know, software that would just be deployed on a machine specification that suited you and that wasn't going to change for 5 years. So yeah, no, it's inevitable, I think.
Excellent. Thank you, guys. And based on the fact we haven't had any further questions, we'll end there. The webinar will be available on demand. So if you want to come back and take another look at some of those answers, then please feel free to do so. Thank you, all three of you, for your responses today. It was great. And thank you to everybody for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again at the next webinar.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Cheers, guys. Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.